The dust had not yet settled on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, when Adelaide Holloway stepped down from the stagecoach and realized, with a cold and sinking certainty, that she had made the worst mistake of her life. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat at the edge of civilization like a tooth on the verge of falling out, rough, necessary, and painful. The cattle drives had made the town wealthy enough to have a proper saloon, a dry goods store, a livery stable, and a small but respectable hotel called the Prairie Star. The streets were wide and unpaved, and the wind came off the open plains with a persistence that suggested it had somewhere important to be. Adelaide stood in the middle of it all with a single worn leather trunk and a bruise on her left wrist. She was doing her best to keep hidden beneath the cuff of her traveling dress. The man who stepped down behind her was named Gerald Pruitt, and he was not a bad-looking man, which had been part of the problem from the beginning. He was 34, broad-shouldered, with thick dark hair and a practiced smile that had convinced Adelaide's widowed mother back in St. Louis that he was exactly the kind of man who could offer a 22-year-old woman a proper life. He had come through St. Louis on business. He claimed to be a cattle broker with land holdings in Kansas, and he had courted Adelaide with a speed that should have told her something. He brought flowers on Tuesdays, spoke of a fine house outside Caldwell, and told her mother that he intended to give Adelaide every comfort. Her mother, worn down by 7 years of widowhood and the constant arithmetic of survival, had nodded and smiled and quietly wept the night before Adelaide's departure. What Gerald Pruitt had failed to mention was that he had debts larger than his ambitions, no house outside Caldwell of any kind, and a temper that came and went like a summer storm, unpredictable and leaving damage in its wake. Adelaide had learned these things during the 2-week journey west. She had learned the first about the debts, when he lost most of their traveling money in a card game outside of Topeka, and then had the gall to look at her as though it were her fault for not stopping him. She had learned about the house when the stagecoach driver asked Gerald where they were headed, and Gerald had said, in a voice not meant for her ears, that he supposed they'd figure that out. And she had learned about the temper on a Tuesday evening in a rest stop near Wichita, when she had asked a perfectly reasonable question about what they would do when they arrived, and Gerald had grabbed her wrist and told her to mind herself. So she stood now in the dust of Caldwell with a bruised wrist and a stubborn spine, and a heart that was equal parts frightened and furious, looking at this town like it was a puzzle she needed to solve as quickly as possible. Gerald appeared beside her, straightening his coat with the air of a man who believed appearances were everything. "Well," he said, "here we are." "Yes," Adelaide replied and kept her voice entirely neutral. "I need to go see about some arrangements," he told her, which she recognized as Gerald language, for he intended to find a saloon and talk to men he half knew. "You stay here and watch the trunk." "I am not a dog," she said, still neutral. Gerald looked at her with the flat expression she had come to recognize as the one that preceded his worst moods. "You are a burden I've been hauling across half of Kansas," he said, his voice pitched low so no one passing on the street could hear. "You stay with the trunk." He walked away toward the far end of the street, and Adelaide watched him go. And then she breathed in the Kansas air, which smelled of cattle and dust and possibility, and she decided that she was not going to stand on this street all afternoon like a piece of luggage. She picked up the smallest of her bags, left the trunk where it stood, it had almost nothing in it worth stealing, and walked toward the dry goods store because it was the closest building, and she needed to think somewhere that was not the open street. The bell above the door announced her, and the store was dim and smelled of coffee and sawdust, and the sharp tang of vinegar from the pickle barrel near the back. A woman behind the counter looked up. She was perhaps 50, with a face that had been weathered by prairie winters but was currently wearing a warm expression. Her name, as Adelaide would learn momentarily, was Ruth Albright, and she ran the store with her husband Clement, though Clement was out at present. "Just arrived?" Ruth asked, because Adelaide was obviously still wearing travel dust. "On the stagecoach," Adelaide confirmed. She set her bag down and pressed her fingers to the edge of the counter because she needed something solid. I wonder if I might ask you a question. Ask away, honey. Is there a respectable establishment in this town where a woman might find work, of any kind? Something honest. Adelaide kept her chin level and her eyes steady because she had decided, somewhere between the bruised wrist and Gerald's voice calling her a burden, that she was not going to let any more men in this world see her falter. Ruth Albright studied her for a long moment with the particular perceptiveness of a woman who had seen hard situations come through her store wearing many different costumes. "What kind of work are you experienced in?" "I can cook," Adelaide said. "I can keep accounts. My father was a bookkeeper and taught me his trade before he passed. I can sew, I can tend a garden, and I speak readable French, for whatever that's worth out here." "Cooking's worth a great deal out here," Ruth said, leaning on the counter. "French is worth nothing, but the cooking and the accounts you might talk to Henry Hudson." "Who is Henry Hudson?" Ruth tilted her head toward the east end of town, past the hotel where Adelaide could see, if she pressed close to the window and looked, the shape of a large building set slightly back from the street. "He runs the Hudson Ranch, 3 miles east of town, brings his cattle up through the Kishom Trail every season. He's a fair man and an honest one. His housekeeper left him 3 weeks ago to get married, not to him, mind you, just in general, and he's been eating burnt beans and looking miserable about it. He also has accounts that need keeping during the spring season when the drives start." "Is he a decent man?" Adelaide asked, because she needed to know before she walked in any direction. Ruth Albright didn't hesitate. "Henry Hudson is the most decent man I know in this county," she said, "and I have known this county for 22 years. That was enough for Adelaide. She thanked Ruth, picked up her bag, and walked east. The Hudson Ranch occupied a generous piece of land just far enough outside Caldwell to feel removed from its noise, but close enough that the town's lights were visible on dark nights. The main house was a solid, wide-built structure of timber and stone, painted white along the trim, with a porch that ran along the whole front face of it. There were barns and a bunkhouse to the north, a vegetable garden that had been recently turned but not yet planted along the south side of the house, and a corral where 3 horses stood in the late afternoon light looking unhurried and content. Adelaide walked the whole 3 miles because she had no coin for a horse or a cart, and by the time she arrived at the gate of the Hudson Ranch, her traveling boots had told her their opinion of Kansas roads in no uncertain terms. She paused at the gate, squared her shoulders, and walked up the path to the front porch. She knocked. There was a beat of silence, and then the sound of boots on a wooden floor, and then the door opened. Henry Hudson was 29 years old, and he had the look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors without thinking much about it. He was tall and solidly built, with dark gold hair that had been somewhat pushed around by whatever he'd been doing before she knocked, and eyes the color of good river water, somewhere between green and gray, with a quality of steadiness that Adelaide noticed immediately. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, canvas trousers, and boots that had seen considerable use. He was not wearing his hat, which she would come to learn was unusual, because the hat almost never came off when there was work to be done. He looked at her with mild surprise and no hostility, which was already a better start than her day had been offering. "Can I help you?" he asked, and his voice was measured and calm. "My name is Adelaide Holloway," she said. "I arrived in Caldwell this afternoon on the stagecoach from St. Louis. I was told by Ruth Albright at the dry goods store that you are in need of a housekeeper and someone who can keep accounts during the cattle season. I am experienced in both. I would like to discuss terms of employment." Henry Hudson looked at her for a long moment, not in the way that Gerald Pruitt had looked at her, not appraising or proprietary, but in the considering way of a man who was taking a situation seriously. His gaze went briefly to her wrist, where the cuff of her dress had shifted slightly in her 3-mile walk, and she saw the flicker of something cross his expression, but he said nothing of it. "You walked out from town," he said. "I did. In those boots. They're the only ones I have at present." He was quiet for a second more, and then he stepped back and held the door open. "Come in and sit down," he said. "I'll put the kettle on." The inside of the house was clean in the way that a man's house is clean when the man is tidy by nature but hasn't had anyone to handle the details. There was an absence of dust on the main surfaces, but the curtains hadn't been beaten. The kitchen hearth needed a proper scrubbing, and the wooden floor, while swept, had the dull look of boards that hadn't been polished in some time. There was a wide stone fireplace in the main room, currently unlit as the spring evening was mild, flanked by two good chairs. A writing desk stood near the window with a neat stack of papers that Adelaide recognized, with a bookkeeper's instinct, as ledgers. She sat in the chair he indicated and tried not to let on how much her feet were grateful for it. He brought her real tea, not the weak Prairie substitute with a biscuit on the side, and sat across from her with his own cup, and they talked plainly and honestly for the better part of an hour about what the work would entail, what the pay would be, where she would sleep, and what the arrangement would look like in practical terms. Henry Hudson's operation was not a small one. He ran close to 300 head of cattle through the season, with a crew of 8 hands who slept in the bunkhouse, and during the months before a drive, there was considerable work in provisioning, planning, and accounting. He needed someone to manage the house cooking, cleaning, preserving, and someone to help him keep the ranch books in order, because he was perfectly capable of managing the cattle end of things, but had a persistent frustration with columns of numbers. Adelaide listened to all of it with genuine attention, and when he had finished describing the situation, she said, "I can do all of that. I would need 2 days a week to make use of the garden, because a garden that's turned but not planted is a garden wasting its potential, and I notice yours has been sitting that way for at least a week." Henry blinked, and then the corner of his mouth moved. 3 weeks, he admitted. "I can also see that your ledger books from the last quarter haven't been properly closed," she continued, because she had been looking at the stack near the window with half her attention for the last 20 minutes. "Which means your spring projections are built on incomplete figures, and that will cause you real difficulties when you go to settle with the cattle buyers in the fall." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The position pays $12 a month plus room and board." In 1878, $12 a month with room and board was a reasonable offer, not extravagant, but honest, and infinitely better than a bruised wrist and the company of Gerald Pruitt. "I accept," Adelaide said. "Is there anything I should know about your situation?" He asked, and his voice had the careful quality of a man who was asking a question he expected might be painful and was prepared to handle the answer gently. Adelaide set her teacup down on the small table beside the chair. "I arrived with a man named Gerald Pruitt," she said. "I believed, when I left St. Louis, that I was coming west to be his wife. I have since learned that Gerald Pruitt is not an honest man, and I have no intention of remaining in his company. He does not know where I am, and I would prefer to keep it that way." Henry Hudson looked at her wrist for just a moment, the briefest, most careful glance, and then he looked at her face, and his eyes were entirely steady. "Your room is at the top of the stairs on the right side," he said. "The door has a lock." Adelaide did not cry. She was not, by nature, a woman who cried easily, and the 7 years of watching her mother manage widowhood on a bookkeeper's savings had built her with a practical spine. But something in the steadiness of that statement, "your room has a lock," made her throat tight in a way she had not expected. "Thank you," she said. "Welcome to the ranch," he said simply, and picked up his teacup. Gerald Pruitt showed up the next morning. Adelaide had risen before dawn because old habits are hard to break, and because she had found in the kitchen the makings of a proper breakfast, and she wanted to show Henry Hudson immediately that she was worth her wages. She had the fire built up, biscuits baking, salt pork frying, and real coffee brewing, not the boiled-to-nothing kind but the kind that smelled like a promise. When she heard the sound of hoofbeats in the yard and looked out the kitchen window to see Gerald riding up on a borrowed horse with an expression like a thunderstorm, Henry had already been up. She could hear him in the barn. The sound of hoofbeats brought him out, and Gerald pulled his horse to a stop in the yard between the barn and the house, and looked down at Henry with the overfamiliar confidence of a man who has never been told no in any language he recognizes. Adelaide came to the kitchen doorway but did not step out. "Watch through the screen. I'm looking for a woman," Gerald said. "Adelaide Holloway, dark hair, green eyes, came out from St. Louis on the stage yesterday. I've been told she might have come out this way." Henry stood with his hands easy at his sides and looked up at Gerald without any particular expression. "What's your business with her?" "She's my woman," Gerald said, as if that settled everything in the world. "Came out here with me. Went missing yesterday afternoon. I've been looking since sundown." "She's not missing," Henry said. "She's employed. She came here yesterday looking for work and I hired her." Gerald's expression shifted into something between offense and confusion. "She doesn't need work. She came out here with me." "She came out here looking for work," Henry said in the same even tone, "and I gave her a position. That's the beginning and end of it as far as I'm concerned." "Now listen here." Gerald started to swing down from the horse, and Henry took one step forward, not aggressive, not threatening, just deliberate and something in the geometry of the situation. Henry Hudson standing on his own land with perfect calm made Gerald hesitate with one boot still in the stirrup. "You can get down if you like," Henry said. "But this is my property, and that means you're here at my invitation, and I have an extended one. The woman you're describing is here of her own free choice, and she's staying of her own free choice. If you have something to say to her, you can do it with me present, and if she tells me she wants to go with you, I'll wish you both a good morning and get back to my work. But if she doesn't, you'll be leaving the same way you came in." There was a silence that stretched out long enough for the wind to move through the yard, rattling a loose board on the barn. Adelaide pushed the screen door open and stepped out. Gerald looked at her with that particular expression men wear when they have planned for one version of events, and the world has declined to cooperate. "Adelaide," he said, adjusting his tone towards something that was meant to sound warm, "come on now. You had me worried half to death." "I left because I chose to leave," Adelaide said. She kept her voice steady, the way she had kept it steady on the street in Caldwell, the way she had kept it steady through a dozen such moments in the 2 weeks of their journey. "I am staying here. I have been offered honest work and a place to sleep, and I am grateful for both." "You are my responsibility," Gerald said, and the warmth in his voice was starting to crack at the edges. "I am no one's responsibility but my own," she said. Gerald's jaw tightened. He looked at Henry with the particular resentment of a man who can't find the angle he's looking for. "She is a burden," he said, and the word came out ugly, like he'd been saving it up. "She doesn't know what she wants. She doesn't know the first thing about this country, and she is more trouble than she is worth. I don't know why you'd want the complication." Henry Hudson looked at Gerald Pruitt for a moment with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who has spent years reading the temperaments of animals and has found it transfers fairly well to certain categories of human being. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and entirely composed. "I've heard everything you've said," Henry told him, "and here is my answer. She walked 3 miles out here yesterday in boots that were not made for it, applied for work with more competence than anyone I've interviewed in 2 years, and cooked a breakfast this morning that I could smell from the barn. A burden is not a word I would use. The only word I would use is capable." He paused. "And she is the only one worth keeping of the 2 of you that's come through my gate this morning. So I'm going to ask you politely to turn that horse around." Gerald stared at him. Then he stared at Adelaide. Then he looked at the house and the barn and the wide Kansas sky as if he might find something in it to argue with, and he found nothing. He pulled his horse around. He did not say goodbye. He rode back down the road toward Caldwell, and Adelaide watched him go from the doorway of the house that was not yet her home but was beginning to feel as though it might become one. Henry came to stand a few feet from her, looking after the retreating horse. "I apologize," he said, "for speaking about your situation without your permission. I didn't know whether you'd want to come out or stay inside." "You said what was true," she told him. I would have said the same things, but it's useful sometimes to have someone standing beside you when you say them. He glanced at her, and there was something in that look brief, considering the beginning of something that neither of them would name for a good long while yet. "Breakfast smells like it might be ready," he said. "It will be in 4 minutes," she said. "Come and wash your hands." He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it as she turned back toward the kitchen. The days settled into a rhythm, and Adelaide Holloway discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she liked the rhythm. She rose early, built the kitchen fire, prepared breakfast for Henry and the 8 ranch hands who came in from the bunkhouse at first light smelling of horses and hay and the cool morning air. There was Domingo Reyes, who was 25 and from a ranching family in South Texas, and spoke 2 languages with equal fluency, and sang quietly to the horses when he thought no one was listening. There was old Cal Briggs, who was 56 and had been working cattle drives since before Adelaide was born, and who sat at the end of the breakfast table every morning with the satisfied expression of a man who has found the one place in the world where he is supposed to be. There were 5 others: Pete, Sam, Jesse, Tom, and a young man everyone called Rabbit because of his tendency to disappear when there was a particularly unpleasant job to be done. And they were, all of them, various degrees of rough around the edges and fundamentally decent. They treated Adelaide with a cautious, deliberate respect that she understood to come directly from Henry Hudson's example. He had said nothing explicit, as far as she could tell, but the example of a man who treats a woman with honest regard speaks more than a posted list of rules. The kitchen itself became hers within a week in the way that kitchens do when someone with genuine feeling for cooking takes them in hand. Adelaide found herbs growing wild along the south edge of the garden plot and transplanted them. She put in tomatoes, squash, and beans once the last frost threat had passed. She reorganized the dry stores in a way that made inventory obvious at a glance, and she found, in the back of a kitchen cabinet, a bottle of good vanilla extract that someone had bought and apparently forgotten, and she put it to use in a bread pudding on a Sunday evening that caused Cal Briggs to set down his spoon and look at his bowl with the reverence of a man at church. "Miss Holloway," he said, "I do not know where you came from, but I am grateful the Almighty sent you." "Sent Louis," she said pleasantly, and passed the serving dish around again. Henry ate at the same table as his hands, which Adelaide had noted on the first morning as an indicator of his character. He was not a man who sat apart because of his position. He worked the same hours as his crew, came in with the same dirt on his boots, and spoke to his men with directness and without condescension. He had, she observed, a natural authority that did not require demonstration, the kind that comes from competence and consistency over time. In the evenings, after supper was cleared and the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, Adelaide would take the ledger books to the writing desk near the window and work by lamplight, and Henry would often sit in the chair across the room reading or doing his own paperwork, and the 2 of them developed, without discussing it, a comfortable habit of working in the same room in companionable quiet. It was in these evenings that they first began, tentatively and without fanfare, to talk. Not about important things at first. About the cattle, about the particular ornery temperament of a steer named Biscuit who had been causing trouble in the south pasture, about the state of the roads north toward Abilene, about the price projections for the fall drive. Henry asked her questions about the accounts with genuine interest, and listened to her answers with the focused attention of a man who is not merely being polite. Adelaide found herself explaining ledger structures and margin calculations with the enthusiasm she had always had for numbers, an enthusiasm that her mother had quietly tolerated and Gerald Pruitt had openly dismissed, and Henry followed every word. "Father taught you this," he said one evening, and it was not a question. "He did," she said. "He believed that a woman who understood numbers was never entirely at anyone's mercy." Henry was quiet for a moment, looking at the lamp. "He sounds like a man worth knowing," he said. "He was," Adelaide said, and the tense of that was old and familiar now, worn smooth with years. Henry looked at her with the gentle directness that she had come to recognize as one of his most consistent qualities. "How long ago?" "7 years. I was 15. He had a weak heart that we didn't know about." "I'm sorry," he said, and the two words had none of the hollow quality that condolences usually carry. They sounded like he meant them specifically for her about her father. "Thank you," she said, and they sat quietly for a moment, and the lamp burned, and the prairie outside the window was dark and enormous, and Adelaide felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was in a place where she could breathe without measuring the air first. She told him in pieces, over the following weeks, about St. Louis, about her mother's careful, exhausted management of their finances after her father died, about the particular indignity of being a woman with intelligence and no capital, about Gerald Pruitt and his flowers and his smooth promises and the way she had believed them because she had wanted, very much, for something to be simple for once. Henry listened to all of it. He did not offer advice she hadn't asked for. He did not tell her what she should have done or seen coming. He listened, and when he spoke, he said things like, "That was not your failing, and you made a decision with the information you had," which were not romantic statements but were, she found, exactly the kind of statements she needed more than she had known. And in return, across the same quiet evenings, Henry told her about himself. He had grown up in Ohio, the son of a farmer, the middle of 5 children. He had come west in 1869 at the age of 20, during the great restlessness that took so many young men west after the war, though he had been too young for the war itself. He had worked cattle in Texas for 3 years, learning the trade from the ground up, sleeping rough, earning wages, saving everything he didn't need for food. He had come to Kansas when the cattle drives were establishing Caldwell as a major point on the Kishom Trail, had bought his first 60 acres with his savings and a bank loan, and had built from that over 9 years of relentless, focused work to the 300 head and 200 acres he currently held. He had never married. He said this without apology or self-consciousness, as a simple fact. "Were you not inclined to?" Adelaide asked, because they had reached the kind of ease with each other where she could ask this without it being inappropriate. "I was inclined to the right person," he said, looking at the dark window. "I was never inclined to the wrong one." She looked at him for a moment and said nothing, and then she looked back at her ledger, and the lamp burned, and somewhere outside a coyote said something to the night. April gave way to May, and May was the serious business of spring on a cattle ranch. The crew worked long days, and Adelaide worked long days of a different kind, preparing 3 hot meals, maintaining the house, putting the garden in properly now that the soil had warmed, and spending 2 hours each evening with the accounts, which were beginning to take the shape of something properly organized. Henry had, under her guidance, been setting aside the right percentages for provisions, wages, and contingency, and the spring tally was starting to look, for the first time in some years, genuinely solid. Ruth Albright came out to the ranch one afternoon in early May, ostensibly for the purchase of eggs, and spent 45 minutes drinking coffee at Adelaide's kitchen table and looking at the changes in the house with an expression of satisfied approval. "He looks better," Ruth said, nodding toward the yard where Henry was visible working at the corral fence. "He's been eating regular meals," Adelaide said. "He's been doing more than eating," Ruth said, with the blunt perceptiveness of a woman who has watched this particular dance before. "He looks like a man who has started to think ahead." Adelaide said nothing to this and offered more coffee, which Ruth accepted. The morning everything shifted was a Thursday in the middle of May, warm enough that the kitchen windows were open and the smell of the garden came in with the breeze. Adelaide had been up since before dawn dealing with a persistent problem in the quarterly accounts, a discrepancy of $11.30 that had been nagging at her for 3 days, and she finally found it at 4 in the morning, and was sitting back in the chair with the particular satisfaction of resolved arithmetic when she heard Henry come downstairs. He stopped in the doorway of the main room when he saw the lamp burning and her still at the desk. "Have you been up all night?" he asked. "I found the discrepancy," she said, and pointed to the ledger. "It was a transposition error in the February feed costs. Everything balances now." He came closer and looked at the ledger over her shoulder, which meant he was standing very near her, and Adelaide was suddenly aware of the hour and the lamplight and the intimacy of the empty house around them. 11:30, he said, reading the corrected figure. $11.30, she confirmed. "It's been keeping me up for 3 nights. He straightened and looked at her. In the lamplight, his expression was unguarded in the way that faces are in the small hours when the usual daytime business of presenting oneself to the world has been set aside. "Adelaide," he said, and then paused, as though he had started a sentence he wasn't entirely sure how to finish. "Henry," she said, and there was the faintest edge of something teasing in it, though she kept her own expression composed. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I don't know any other way." She turned her chair to face him properly and folded her hands in her lap. "Then say it plainly." He looked at her with those steady gray-green eyes. "I was glad you came to my door," he said. "I was glad from the first hour, and I've been glad every morning since. And I want you to know that, not as your employer, but as—" He stopped. "As," she prompted quietly. "As a man who finds that he is considerably happier when you are in the same room," he said. Adelaide looked at him for a long moment, and something in her chest that had been held tightly for a very long time, since Gerald, and before Gerald, since the exhausting years of being the capable one in her family who didn't have the luxury of needing anyone, relaxed by one careful degree. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am also considerably happier when you are in the same room. And I want you to know that this is not a small thing for me to say, because I have not said anything like it to anyone in several years." He held her gaze for a moment. Then, with a deliberateness that was entirely characteristic of him, he extended his hand. She looked at it and then at him. "I thought perhaps we might walk," he said. "It's a good morning." "It's 4 in the morning," she said. "The best kind," he said. She took his hand. They walked out onto the porch, and the Kansas night was enormous and dark and thick with stars in a way that cities never allow. The Milky Way laid across the sky like a brushstroke. The air was cool and smelled of the garden and the distant cattle and the particular clean darkness of the plains. They stood at the porch railing side by side with their hands linked, and neither of them spoke for a while, and it was the best kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. "My father used to say," Adelaide said eventually, "that the stars were the same stars no matter where you stood on the earth, and that this was the most comforting fact he knew." "That is a good fact," Henry agreed. She looked up at the sky. "He was right," she said. "The same stars as St. Louis, but they look different from here." "Bigger," he said. "Brighter," she said, "like they're paying attention." He turned his head to look at her profile, and she felt it without looking. "I know what you mean," he said. She turned to look at him, and they were close. The kind of close that the dark and the narrow porch and the linked hands had made natural. And she looked at him for a long moment, and he looked at her. And then he leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to decide otherwise, and she didn't decide otherwise. The kiss was quiet and careful and genuine, and the stars above them were enormous, and neither of them said anything for quite some time after. June arrived, and with it the beginning of serious preparations for the summer cattle drive, which would take 300 head north toward Abilene and return in late August or early September. The ranch hummed with organized activity. The hands were busy with branding and sorting and equipment checks. Henry rode out for long days and came back in the evenings with dust on his hat and the practical satisfaction of a man doing work he is good at. Adelaide ran the house with an efficiency that had, over the past 2 months, become something more than just efficient. She had made it into something that felt lived in and cared for, which are different qualities from clean. She had put curtains up in the main room, practical cotton, in a blue-gray that she'd found in Ruth Albright's dry goods store, and negotiated down to a price, she could manage on her wages. She had put the garden in fully, and it was growing with the enthusiastic productivity of land that had been sitting waiting for attention. She had organized the pantry, mended the curtains in the bunkhouse, which the hands had received with an embarrassed gratitude that amused her greatly, and had, in the process of keeping the accounts, identified 3 places where the ranch's purchasing arrangements could be renegotiated for better terms. She presented these findings to Henry one evening in early June with the account spread across the writing desk, and he read through her notes with his full attention, and then looked at her with an expression that sat somewhere between impressed and something warmer. "You found this in the flour supplier arrangement," he said. "He's been charging you a wholesale rate that was only wholesale 3 years ago," Adelaide said. "The market rate has come down. You could renegotiate the current contract and save approximately $14 per quarter." "$14," he repeated. "$56 a year," she said. "Over 5 years, that is $280. Over 10, it is $560. It is not nothing." He looked at her for a moment. Then he set the paper down and said, "Adelaide, yes, will you marry me?" The words went out into the room and sat there, and Adelaide looked at him, and Henry Hudson looked back at her with that particular expression that was not casual, not the practiced smile of Gerald Pruitt, not the calculated warmth of a man who wants something, but the face of a man who has thought carefully and arrived somewhere real. "I realize," he said when the silence had stretched a beat, "that is a large question to follow $56. "It is," she said. "The 2 things are not connected," he clarified. "I know they are not," she said. "I am asking because I have not stopped thinking about you since the morning you walked up to my door," he said. "I am asking because every single day since then has been better than the day before it, which I did not know was still possible. I am asking because I believe we suit each other in ways that are rare and worth protecting. And I am asking because I love you, Adelaide, which I should probably have said first." She looked at him for a long moment, and inside her chest there was a warmth that was nothing like what she had felt for Gerald Pruitt, nothing like the anxious, hopeful, performing kind of feeling that had mistaken itself for love. This was something quieter and deeper, something that had been growing in the same patient way as the garden, from good soil and consistent care. "I love you too," she said, and her voice was entirely steady. "And yes, I will marry you." He stood up from the chair across from her and came to her side of the desk, and she stood, and he took her hands, and they stood there in the lamplight for a long moment just looking at each other, and it was one of those rare, perfect moments that life offers without announcement. He kissed her again, more thoroughly than the first time on the porch, and when they were done she pressed her forehead against his jaw and said, against his collar, "I should still finish the quarterly summary." He laughed, which was the best sound she had heard in Kansas, and held her for a moment longer and then said, "Finish the quarterly summary." They were married on the 15th of June, 1878, in Caldwell, at the small Methodist church that stood 2 blocks off the main street. Ruth Albright and Clement came, looking pleased with themselves in the way of people who have watched something develop that they suspected would. Cal Briggs and the whole bunkhouse crew turned up in various states of pressed cleanliness that clearly represented their best effort, and Domingo Reyes had, apparently, polished his boots, which caused old Cal to stare. Adelaide wore her best dress, which was not a wedding dress but was a good wool in a dark cream color that she had put her best summer collar on, and she carried 3 sprigs of lavender from the garden because she was practical about flowers. Henry wore his good coat and a clean white shirt, and had his hair combed properly for the first time since she'd known him. The minister was a serious man named Reverend Hartley, who conducted the ceremony with appropriate gravity, and when he said the part about speaking now or forever holding one's peace, there was a small collective pause in the room, as though everyone present was briefly, privately considering whether Gerald Pruitt might appear in the doorway. He did not. He had, as Adelaide had learned from Ruth a week prior, packed up and left Caldwell in late April, headed back toward somewhere east, and she found she had nothing left to feel about that except a distant, mild relief. Henry held her hands through the whole ceremony with a steadiness that was entirely characteristic and entirely his. And when Reverend Hartley said he could kiss his bride, Henry did so with a thoroughness that made Cal Briggs clear his throat and Domingo Reyes look at the ceiling. Afterward there was a dinner at the Prairie Star Hotel, which Ruth Albright organized without being asked, and which Adelaide found, when she arrived, was more generous than anything she had expected. A proper spread of roast beef and pie and bread, and even a small wedding cake that Ruth had made herself, because Ruth was, in addition to all her other qualities, a very good baker. They danced in the hotel dining room to music provided by a fiddler named Archie, who knew every reel and waltz that the occasion required, and Henry danced with deliberate but genuine effort, leading her through the steps with his hands solid on her waist, and when they danced close, she could feel the steadiness of him against her, and thought that she could spend a very long time in exactly this proximity. Cal Briggs danced with Ruth Albright. Domingo danced with the hotel proprietor's daughter, who had come in to help serve and stayed because the music was good. The evening had the particular quality of an occasion that is uncomplicated by pretense. Everyone there was genuinely glad to be there, genuinely glad for the reason, and the happiness in the room was the real kind. They went back to the ranch that night under the same enormous Kansas stars, and the ranch, when they arrived, felt different in the way that spaces sometimes do when the people in them have named what they are to each other. The summer passed with the particular fullness of a first year of marriage between two people who have chosen wisely. Henry rode out with the cattle drive in the first week of July. He had to go, as it was his operation and his responsibility, and the 3 weeks of his absence gave Adelaide her first experience of managing the ranch alone. She did not particularly enjoy his absence, but she managed it with competence, and when he rode back in on a Tuesday evening in late July, dusty and trail-worn and considerably satisfied with the prices he'd gotten in Abilene, she was on the porch waiting, and he swung down from his horse and came to her and kissed her for a long enough time that Domingo, leading the horses to the barn behind Henry, began to sing something quietly to himself out of a tactful respect for the moment. August was the garden's best month. Adelaide had planted with more optimism than she'd admitted at the time, and the results were spectacular tomatoes and squash and beans in quantities that required serious organizational effort. She put up 18 jars of tomatoes and 12 of squash, and made a green bean pickle that Cal Briggs declared the finest thing he had consumed in the last decade, and she suspected he wasn't exaggerating much. In September, she discovered that she was expecting a child. She told Henry on a Sunday morning, before the rest of the house was up, standing in the kitchen in the early light, and she watched his face go through something she had never seen on it before, a kind of complete, unguarded joy that started in his eyes and worked its way outward until he looked like a man who had been handed something he had quietly hoped for without letting himself say so. He came across the kitchen and took her face in his hands carefully, as though she had become newly fragile, which she found she was going to have to address because she was not fragile and did not intend to be treated as such, but she let it go for this particular morning because the expression on his face was worth allowing. "Are you well?" he asked. "Entirely," she said. "A little tired in the mornings. The accounts are still current." "I don't care about the accounts this morning," he said. "That is unprecedented," she said. He kissed her, and she laughed against his mouth, and he laughed too, and the kitchen filled with the smell of the coffee she'd set on the fire, and the sound of two people who were, unreservedly, happy. Adelaide continued the household work through her pregnancy without any significant reduction in her productivity, a fact that Henry fretted about privately and raised once, carefully, and then let alone after she pointed out that she knew her own body's capacity better than he did, which was entirely true. She did allow him to take over the heavier lifting without complaint, and she allowed Ruth Albright, who had become her nearest friend and who came out to the ranch twice a week now, with or without commercial pretense, to fuss over her in the ways that felt genuinely helpful versus the ways that felt like being managed. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a hard one in Kansas, which they were prepared for. The pantry was fully stocked, the woodpile was enormous. Henry had spent October in a sustained effort to ensure they would not be cold, and the cattle had been brought into the closer pastures where they could be managed. The snow came in December and stayed, and the ranch existed in a white and quiet world, and Adelaide found that she did not mind it at all. She spent the winter evenings teaching Henry the finer points of double-entry bookkeeping, which he applied himself to with the same focused determination he brought to everything, and by February he could manage the basic accounts himself, which had been her secret goal all along. She also spent time writing letters to her mother in St. Louis, who had responded to the news of her marriage with a letter of such mingled relief and joy that Adelaide had cried over it in the kitchen, while Henry pretended not to notice from across the room. Her mother's name was Clara Holloway, and she had been managing on her own in St. Louis for 7 years with the quiet endurance that life sometimes demands of people it has decided to treat roughly. Adelaide's letters home were detailed and honest. She described the ranch, the land, Henry, the coming child, Ruth Albright and the dry goods store, Cal Briggs and his remarkable opinions about food, Domingo and his quiet horse songs. She described the stars and the size of the sky, and the way the Kansas plains looked in every season she had seen them so far. Her mother's letters back were shorter and full of love. In one of the February letters, Adelaide wrote to her mother about something she had been thinking about for weeks. Her mother was living in a rented room in St. Louis, working as a seamstress, and while she was not starving, she was not prosperous, and she was alone, and there was no reason for that to continue now that Adelaide had a home large enough to accommodate her. She had discussed this with Henry before she wrote the letter, because it was his house too and his decision as much as hers. He had listened to her lay out the situation, her mother's circumstances, the spare room upstairs, the distance of 3 miles from Caldwell, and then said, "When should I arrange the train fare?" Adelaide had looked at him. "You haven't any objection. Why would I object to your mother coming to live with us?" he said with genuine puzzlement. "Many men would," she said. "I'm not many men," he said, and she looked at him for a moment and thought, no, he was decidedly not. Clara Holloway arrived in Caldwell in March of 1879, on a day when the last of the snow was retreating from the open fields, but the prairie grasses were already beginning to reassert their annual ambitions. Adelaide met her at the stagecoach stop, and the two women held each other for a long time in the middle of the dusty street, and then Clara held her daughter at arm's length and looked at her with the particular assessment of a mother who has been worried for a long time and is now taking inventory of whether the worry was warranted. "You look well," Clara said. "You look better than well." "I am better than well," Adelaide confirmed. "And he is as you described." Adelaide looked back toward where Henry stood at the edge of the street, having driven them in from the ranch with the wagon, hat in his hands in deference to meeting someone's mother, looking rather endearingly uncertain about the protocol involved. "He is exactly as I described," she said. Clara turned and looked at Henry Hudson, and Henry looked back at her, and then Clara walked over and offered her hand and said, "You are the man who sent Gerald Pruitt away." "I am," he said, and shook her hand with the same gravity she'd offered it. "Then you have my gratitude," she said, "and I am pleased to meet you." "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Welcome to Kansas." Her mother settled into the upstairs spare room and within a week had quietly organized herself into the household in a way that added rather than disrupted. She was an extraordinary seamstress, which meant that the mending burden that had always been at the bottom of Adelaide's priority list suddenly vanished. She was also, like her daughter, accustomed to the practical work of keeping a household running, and she and Adelaide fell into an easy collaboration in the kitchen that doubled the ranch's output in food without doubling the effort. Henry treated Clara with a natural, uncomplicated respect that was not performance. He consulted her opinions when they were relevant, included her in the table conversation, and showed no sign of feeling encroached upon by her presence in his house. Clara, for her part, watched this with an approval that she expressed to Adelaide privately as follows: "He is what your father was, in the best way." Adelaide had understood. The baby came on the 14th of April, 1879, on a morning with a warm south wind and the smell of the garden already beginning from the newly turned soil. Ruth Albright was present, as she had appointed herself with a calm authority that no one had the energy to contest, along with a woman named Mrs. Crane who served as the nearest available midwife. Henry was sent to the main room with Cal Briggs, who had appointed himself moral support for the occasion, and who provided this service by sitting in the corner chair and whittling with extreme concentration and refusing to look at anyone. The baby was a boy. Henry was informed of this approximately 3 minutes after the fact, and Adelaide, watching his face appear in the doorway of the bedroom, thought that the expression on it was perhaps the finest thing she had ever seen on a human face, unguarded and joyful and slightly astonished, as though the world had confirmed something he had hoped for but hadn't quite trusted. He came and sat beside her and looked at the baby, who was small and emphatically present and had a completely unreasonable amount of dark hair, and Henry looked at him for a long time without saying anything. "Hello," he finally said, very quietly to the baby. The baby was unimpressed by this greeting but tolerated it. "What shall we name him?" Adelaide asked. Henry looked at her and then at the baby and thought for a moment with genuine consideration. "Thomas," he said, "after no one in particular, just because it suits him." Adelaide looked at her son and said, "Thomas Hudson," which did suit him, and the name was agreed upon. Clara Holloway, who was sitting in the chair by the window, wiped her eyes with her handkerchief very discreetly, though no one in the room was fooled. Thomas Hudson grew through that first year, with the robust energy of a child who has been well fed and well held. He was, from the very beginning, a sociable creature who seemed to find the constant activity of the ranch entirely to his liking. The hands adored him with a universal and uncritical devotion that Adelaide found both touching and occasionally inconvenient. Domingo, in particular, could be relied upon to spend 20 minutes making faces at Thomas that would make him laugh, a project he undertook with the same focused dedication he applied to his actual work. Cal Briggs held Thomas with the careful reverence of a man who has been handling fragile things with gloves on all his life, and is still a little surprised at himself for managing it. And Tom, as he came to be called by everyone except his mother and grandmother, treated Cal's substantial mustache with a scientific curiosity that Cal endured with stoic dignity. The ranch grew. In the spring of 1880, Henry purchased an additional 50 acres to the east, which Adelaide had identified 6 months earlier as the most productive-looking land adjacent to their current holdings, and which he had negotiated for with the patience and precision she had come to recognize as one of his most effective professional qualities. The additional land allowed for a larger herd and a more ambitious drive schedule, and the accounts, which Adelaide continued to manage with the help of Henry's improving mathematical education, showed a growth trajectory that was genuinely encouraging. Adelaide's mother had, by this point, become as much a part of the ranch as anyone. She had taken over the sewing and mending entirely, and had added to this a small but growing enterprise making garments for other families in the area, not a commercial endeavor in any formal sense, but a natural extension of her skill that was generally compensated in the form of eggs, or preserved goods, or once, memorably, 2 laying hens that arrived in a crate on the porch, and which Adelaide greeted with a resigned acceptance that made Henry laugh for the better part of an afternoon. Ruth Albright came twice a week, and had, over the months, evolved from Adelaide's first friend in Kansas to something closer to family. She was godmother to Tom at his christening, which she had accepted with the brisk, pleased manner of a woman receiving an obvious honor she is not entirely certain she deserved. One evening in the late summer of 1880, Adelaide and Henry were sitting on the porch after supper. Tom was asleep. Clara was inside reading by lamplight. The hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the evening was soft and purple and enormous. And Henry was quiet in the way he sometimes was, the comfortable quiet that she no longer mistook for distance. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He looked at the horizon, where the last of the light was doing something spectacular in shades of orange and deep red. "2 years ago," he said. "Which part?" "The morning you walked up to my gate," he said. "And what would have happened if you hadn't?" Adelaide considered this. "I'd have had to find somewhere else," she said. "I wasn't going back with Gerald." "I know," he said, "but what would have happened if you'd gone somewhere else, if you'd found work somewhere else?" He paused. "I would never have known." She looked at him. "That's a strange thing to think about." "It haunts me a little," he said with a rueful quality. "All the ways it almost didn't happen." She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. His hand turned and held hers, which was by now entirely instinctive between them. "But it did happen," she said. "It did," he agreed. "Because I walked 3 miles in the wrong boots," she said. "Because Ruth Albright told you my name," he said. "Because Gerald Pruitt was a fool," she said. "Because you weren't," he said. She squeezed his hand. The last light was going, and the first stars were coming in from the east, and the prairie below the sky was settling into its enormous, companionable dark. Tom would be up before sunrise because he was currently at an age that considered sunrise a generous approximation of sleeping in, and there were accounts to reconcile in the morning and a delivery of supplies coming from town on Thursday, and the second cutting of hay needed to happen before the week was out. All of this was real and true and waiting, and Adelaide was glad of every bit of it. "Henry," she said. "Adelaide," he replied. "I love you," she said, because she had learned that the saying of it was worth doing, and not just in important moments but in the ordinary ones too, because the ordinary ones turned out to be where most of life happened. "I love you," he said, without hesitation and without performance, the way he said most true things directly and completely. They sat together as the stars came in, and the dark settled across the land they had built their life on, and somewhere in the house behind them their small son slept, and Clara Holloway turned the pages of her book by lamplight, and the ranch existed in its quiet, purposeful way around them, and it was, Adelaide thought, precisely and entirely enough. In October of 1880, a situation arose that brought a reminder that the world outside their gate was not always as calm as the evenings on the porch. A man came through Caldwell with a story that quickly spread across the town and out to the surrounding farms and ranches, a story about a family named Marsh, who had settled 20 miles south of Caldwell 3 years prior, and who had recently lost their homestead to a land claim dispute that was, by all available accounts, not honest. The Marsh family, father, mother, and 3 children, had been forced off their land by a man named Cofield who had come in with a lawyer and a set of documents that the Marsh family, who were not educated people, had been unable to effectively contest. Adelaide heard this story from Ruth on a Wednesday and had been quiet about it for the rest of the day, and Henry, who knew her quiet face well enough to read the different kinds of it, asked over supper what she was turning over in her mind. She told him about the Marsh family. He was quiet while she spoke, and quiet for a moment after, and then said, "What would you have us do?" "I don't know what can be done about the land," she said honestly. "I don't know the law of it well enough. But the family is in Caldwell with nowhere to go and 3 children and a coming winter." She paused. "I have been thinking about the bunkhouse." Henry set his fork down and looked at her. "The bunkhouse has the west room that has been empty since Pete left in August," she said. "It is a proper room with a stove. It would fit a family temporarily through the winter while the situation is sorted out. The children would be here," he said, which was not an objection, just an observation. "Tom would be delighted," she said. Henry thought for a moment, in that way of his that was actual thinking rather than performance of deliberation. "Have Domingo hitch the wagon in the morning," he said. "We'll go into town and find them." The Marsh family, Daniel and Ellen Marsh, with their children James aged 9, Mary aged 6, and an infant named George, came to the Hudson Ranch the next afternoon, and were installed in the west room of the bunkhouse with the somewhat overwhelming hospitality of a household that had been given a problem it could actually solve. Ellen Marsh was a quiet, capable woman who had the look of someone who has been frightened for a long time and is still adjusting to the removal of that particular burden. She and Adelaide understood each other almost immediately, in the way of women who have both navigated situations that required more endurance than should reasonably be asked of anyone. Daniel Marsh was a good man with practical skills and a genuine willingness to work, and Henry put him to use in the November work of preparing the ranch for winter, which was plentiful, and which Daniel took on with the focused gratitude of a man who cannot do much about the large things but can, at least, be useful about the small ones. Adelaide spent an evening with the land claim papers that Daniel had brought, reading through them with the careful attention she brought to accounts. She found, after 2 hours, that the documents Cofield had used were not as unassailable as he had apparently represented. There was a boundary description that did not match the original land office filing, which was a discrepancy that could, with the right application to the appropriate authorities, form the basis of a legitimate contest. She brought this to Henry, and Henry took it to a lawyer in Caldwell named Mr. Fredericks, who was an honest man, and Mr. Fredericks agreed that there was something to pursue, and the matter was taken up with the appropriate federal land office, which was a slow process but not ultimately an unsuccessful one. This took until the spring of 1881, by which point the Marsh family had spent the winter at the Hudson Ranch, and James Marsh had taught Tom, with an older boy's condescending generosity, to walk with authority, and Ellen Marsh had become something like a second aunt to Tom, and Clara Holloway had mended every garment the Marsh family owned twice over, and the west room of the bunkhouse had acquired in its window a small potted plant that Ellen had coaxed through the Kansas winter with a gardener's determination. When the land decision came back in the Marsh family's favor in March of 1881, Ellen Marsh cried at the kitchen table, and Adelaide sat with her and held her hand, and said nothing, because nothing was needed. And later that evening Daniel Marsh shook Henry's hand with both of his, and a silence that said everything he apparently couldn't get into words, and Henry received this with the simple, straightforward grace he brought to all things. The Marsh family went back to their land in April, on a morning that was bright and full of the smell of the prairie coming back to life after winter, and they took the potted plant with them. Adelaide stood on the porch and watched them go, and Henry came to stand beside her. "The accounting of kindness," she said, "is the one kind that doesn't need to balance." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the wagon take the Marsh family south until it was a small, moving shape against the enormous Kansas spring. In May of 1881, Adelaide told Henry she was expecting their second child. He received this news in the kitchen at breakfast, which meant that Cal Briggs and Domingo and the rest of the hands were present, and when Henry's face did the thing it did with important joy, Cal looked at his plate with great discretion, and Domingo became extremely interested in the view from the window, and Tom, who was 2 and had no discretion whatsoever, banged his spoon on the table and shouted something that wasn't a word but was clearly enthusiastic. "Tom agrees," Henry said. "Tom always agrees with everything," Adelaide said. "He has not yet developed preferences. He prefers biscuits over corn bread," Cal offered. "That is the most discerning thing he's ever done," Adelaide agreed. The pregnancy was easier than the first, which Adelaide attributed to being better rested, better fed, and less surprised by the general requirements of the state than she had been with Tom. She continued the accounts and the kitchen and the garden with her usual consistency, accepting Henry's increasing offers to carry heavy things with a graciousness that had improved considerably from her first pregnancy's firm resistance. Clara Holloway, for her part, began quietly assembling small garments from the good fabric she had been saving, which was her way of celebrating without saying so. The second child arrived in December of 1881, on a cold, clear night when the stars were brilliant and still over the Kansas plains. This time it was a girl, small and alert from the first moment, with Adelaide's green eyes and what would prove to be a decided opinion about everything. They named her Frances. Tom's reception of Frances was initially suspicious and then comprehensively converted. Within a week, he had appointed himself her primary observer and took his responsibility with a seriousness that everyone found both touching and gently comic. He would stand at the edge of her cradle and look at her with the focused attention of someone conducting important research, and would then report his findings to anyone available. Henry held Frances for the first time with the same careful reverence he had held Tom, but with the addition of a certain practiced ease that the first child had bought with all the anxiety it had cost. He looked at her for a long time and then looked at Adelaide with an expression she would keep in her memory for the rest of her life. "Frances," he said. "Frances," she confirmed. "She looks like you," he said. "She has your chin," Adelaide said. He looked at the baby's chin. "I hope not," he said. "It's not an interesting chin." "It's a very good chin," Adelaide said firmly. "I'll trust you on that," he said. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are, not without difficulty, because Kansas winters were unforgiving, and the cattle business had its failures alongside its successes, and there were seasons that were leaner than others, and a summer in 1883 that brought a drought severe enough to threaten the South Pasture's grass, and required the kind of careful management that tested every skill Henry and Adelaide had built between them. But the ranch held, and the family held, and the accounts, under Adelaide's continued stewardship, stayed honest and clear, and the garden came back every spring with the same defiant optimism, and Tom grew into a boy who loved horses with the same complete devotion that Domingo showed them, and Frances grew into a girl who had decided opinions and a vocabulary that exceeded her age considerably, qualities that no one in the household found in the least surprising. Clara Holloway lived at the ranch, and her health stayed good through those years in the way of women who have been given something to live for after a long stretch of merely surviving. She was teaching Frances to sew by the time Frances was 4, which Frances tolerated with the patient tolerance of someone who considers this an acceptable price for her grandmother's company. Ruth Albright visited twice a week, without fail, through every season and every weather, and her friendship with Adelaide had deepened over the years into the kind that requires no performance or maintenance. The kind that simply is, as steadily as a river or a good stone wall. Old Cal Briggs retired from active ranch work in 1883, when his joints finally registered their formal protest against decades of outdoor labor in all weathers, but he did not leave. Henry offered him the use of a small cabin on the east edge of the property, built over the winter of 1882, and Cal accepted with the dignified gratitude of a man who has worked hard all his life and is not accustomed to being offered anything he didn't earn. He puttered around the edges of ranch life with the contentment of someone who has nowhere else to be and has made peace with that. Tom, at 4, had discovered that Cal was an inexhaustible source of stories, and Cal had discovered that Tom was an inexhaustible audience for them, and the two of them could be found on Cal's porch on summer evenings in a configuration that Adelaide found, on the occasion she walked that way, so completely right that she always turned back quietly rather than interrupt it. Domingo Reyes left the ranch in the fall of 1882, not because of any failing between him and Henry, but because he had met and was intending to marry a woman from a ranching family in the Texas Panhandle and needed to go south to do it. He left on a morning in October with his horse and his good boots and shook every hand on the ranch, and when he came to Adelaide, he took his hat off and said, "You made this place something different, Miss Adelaide, something better." "It was already something good," she said. I only helped it be what it wanted to be. He replaced himself, in a sense, not directly, but the gap he left was filled over time by new hands who came through as the ranch's reputation for honest dealing and fair wages spread through the county. Henry had always paid his men fairly and treated them well, and this produced, over time, a kind of loyalty that money alone doesn't buy. The bunkhouse had a low turnover, which was not common in the cattle business, and the men who stayed tended to stay for years. By 1884, the Hudson Ranch was one of the most productive operations in Sumner County, Kansas. Adelaide's ledgers showed a consistent, clear-headed story of growth built on practical decisions and honest accounting. No debt they couldn't manage, no expansion they hadn't planned for, no season that caught them entirely unprepared. Henry ran the operation with the same steady hand he'd always had, and Adelaide ran the household and the books with the same competence she had brought to his door in the spring of 1878. They were not wealthy in the way that wealth is sometimes talked about, not dramatically, not ostentatiously. But they were prosperous in the way that really counts. The pantry was full, the land was good, the children were growing, the people around them were cared for, and the accounts told a story of a life being built with intention. One evening in the early fall of 1884, when Tom was 5 and Frances was 2.5 and Clara was in the main room teaching Frances the names of her embroidery stitches, with a patience that could have been bottled and sold, Adelaide and Henry sat on the porch at the end of a long day, watching the sun go down over the prairie. Tom was at Cal's cabin, where he had been since after supper and would be collected before dark, currently receiving, Adelaide suspected, a detailed account of some cattle drive from 30 years prior that Cal had told 14 times already, but which Tom listened to each time as though it were new, which was perhaps the most generous thing that could be said about either of them. Adelaide had her mending in her lap, though the light was getting too low for it, and Henry had his hat in his hands, turned by the brim in the slow circles that meant he was thinking. "What are you turning over?" she asked, because 6 years of marriage had given her the question and the confidence to ask it. He looked at her. The evening light was doing something fine with the plains behind him, all amber and deep gold, and he looked, she thought, exactly like himself, the most complete version of himself, the one that had been there from the beginning but had come clearer with the years. "I was thinking about what we have," he said. "Tell me," she said. "This," he said, with a gesture that took in the ranch and the house and the darkening sky. "Tom and Frances. Your mother inside teaching Frances to count stitches. Cal telling Tom tall tales, Ruth and her twice-weekly visits, Domingo somewhere in the Texas panhandle being happy with his wife." He paused. "All of it. I was thinking that I am grateful for all of it in a way I can't entirely account for." "I know the feeling," she said. "Do you ever think about St. Louis?" he asked. "About what you left?" She considered this honestly as she considered everything. "Sometimes," she said, "I think about the version of that life that might have gone differently, not with Gerald, but just the life. The small apartment above the bookkeeper's office that I thought about renting when my father died, that I couldn't afford. The kind of life I was going to have." She looked out at the prairie. "And then I look at this, and I can't regret any of it, because the wrong turns brought me to the right place. The wrong boots on the right road," he said, which was a reference to a conversation they had had on the porch of this same house years ago, and she was moved, as she always was, by the fact that he kept those things. "Exactly," she said. He set his hat down and reached over and took her hand, and they sat like that as the light went out of the sky, and the stars came in, and somewhere across the dark land Tom's voice carried from Cal's direction, high and excited and completely happy. And inside the house, Frances said something in her decisive 2-year-old way, and Clara laughed, a warm, rich laugh that Adelaide had been hearing all her life, and that still meant more than she could say. Henry brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to the back of it, a gesture that was entirely characteristic and had not diminished with familiarity into something merely routine. "I love you, Adelaide Hudson," he said. "I love you, Henry," she said, "also entirely and without reservation. Even after 6 years. More after 6 years," she said. "That is generally how it works with things worth having." He smiled the real smile, the one that started in his eyes and took the rest of his face a moment to catch up. And she thought, as she had thought many times before, that it was the best thing she'd ever been the cause of. The years ahead of them, and there were many, would hold all the ordinary extraordinary things that a life built in good faith tends to accumulate. The spring of 1886 would bring a third child, a boy they named Joseph, who would arrive in the world with Henry's coloring and a temperament of complete serenity that would be a source of great comedy to his elder siblings and great relief to his parents. Tom would grow into a young man with Domingo's feeling for horses and his father's steadiness, taking his first real cattle drive at 14, with a self-possession that made Henry quietly proud in ways he expressed mainly by not saying anything and looking at the middle distance. Frances would grow into a young woman with opinions on everything and the capability to defend them, inheriting her mother's gift with numbers and adding to it a verbal dexterity that was entirely her own. Clara Holloway would live to see all three of her grandchildren walk, and would spend her last years in the house that had become her home in a way that St. Louis never quite had, tending her corner of the garden and her grandchildren and her embroidery with equal devotion. And when she passed in the winter of 1891, she went in her own bed in her own room in the house of people who loved her, which is the best way anyone can manage it. Adelaide grieved her mother with the honest, undefended grief of someone who has no regrets to complicate the loss, and Henry sat with her through all of it with the same steady, wordless presence he had always offered, which was exactly what she needed, and he knew it. Ruth Albright would remain the Hudsons' nearest and dearest neighbor and friend for the rest of Ruth's long life, her twice-weekly visits becoming as fixed a feature of the ranch's calendar as the seasons themselves. Her husband Clement would eventually retire from the store and take up fishing, with very little success, as a hobby. Ruth and Clement would be at the Hudson table more often than not, and their presence at every significant occasion of the family's life christenings, harvests, the first day of school for each Hudson child, and eventually the weddings of all three would be as natural and expected as good weather. Cal Briggs would live in his East Edge cabin until his 81st year, telling stories that grew taller with each telling and being listened to with the devotion he had earned. And when he died it was in his chair on his porch on a summer evening, apparently having simply stopped, which was, everyone agreed, as good an exit as a man could arrange. The Hudson Ranch would grow and deepen through all of it, tended by two people who had built it together from the soil up. Literally, in Adelaide's case, who kept the garden going for every year she had breath to tend it, and figuratively in every decision made at the writing desk by lamplight, every account balanced, every season managed, every hard year held steady by two people who had decided, in the most practical and permanent way, to face things together. And on the evenings when the work was done, and the children were somewhere being themselves, and the light was going gold over the prairie, Henry and Adelaide Hudson would sit on the porch of their home and hold hands and say the true things to each other, and watch the stars come in over Kansas the way they always had, enormous and bright and paying attention. The same stars as St. Louis, but looking entirely different from here, because everything looks different when you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Adelaide Holloway had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1878 with a bruised wrist and one worn trunk, and the stubborn spine of a woman who had decided, quietly and without announcement, that she was not finished. She had walked 3 miles in the wrong boots to a gate she had been told about by a woman she'd just met, and knocked on a door belonging to a man she didn't know, and asked for work. And Henry Hudson had opened the door and said, "Come in and sit down, I'll put the kettle on." The rest of it, the work, the evenings, the hands held in the dark, the children, the years, the whole large and particular life of it, had grown from that open door, and that kettle and two people who had, between them, the good sense to recognize something real when they were standing right next to it. That was all the miracle it needed to be. That was, as it turned out, more than enough.